EU 諸国をはじめ世界に知れ渡ることとなったブレグジット。2016年の離脱を決める投票前世論調査では過半数以上が残留という結果になっておりました。これにより楽観的だった一部投票者の間では投票しに行かなかった人がいました。しかし最終的な投票結果では 52% 弱の国民が離脱に投票し EU からの離脱を余儀なくされます。そして47年間の EU 加盟を得て2020年12月31日に完全な離脱が完了。2024年末時点で複数の世論調査によると EU を離脱して正しかったと考える人は約 35% にとどまっています。この変化の背景には予想以上に深刻な経済、旅行、貿易、ビジネス運営に関する実務上の困難、そして約束された方針や政策が期待通りに実現されていないという不満などがあります。依然支持している人はどういう考えなのか調べてみました。皆さんこんにちは、シンです。今回の動画はブレグジットについてです。冒頭の方でも触れたんですけれども、そのイギリス国内でブレグジットは間違いだった、または反対派の意見というのが、現在年々上昇傾向にありますと。で、イギリスって私が聞く限りでは、その政治的な意見だったり見解っていうのを、言うのはあまり好まれていませんと。なので、今回その賛成派の方々が少数派に回ったことにより、なおさら公の場で意見を言うのが難しくなっちゃってるんじゃないかなというふうに思っていました。で、現在 EU 完全離脱してから4年ぐらい経つんですけれども、確かにやっぱり EU 離脱は間違いだったよね、ブレグジットは失敗だったよねっていうような意見だったり見解だったりデータは様々なところで見受けられます。なんですけれども、ちょっと後出しじゃんけん感はあるんですが、それなりに客観性のあるデータにはなっているので、結構頭の中スッと入ってくる内容にはなるんですよね。なんですけれども、こういうデータを見てもなお、依然ブレグジットを賛成されている方ってどういう方なんだろうっていうので、気になっていて、今回、一人、お話を聞かせていただける方がいたので、ちょっとお話を聞かせていただくみたいな形でこの動画を作ろうと思います。で、この方からはですね、顔出しは OK っていうふうには言ってくださってるんですけれども、センシティブな話にはなるんじゃないかなと思っているので、顔は伏せての撮影をさせていただこうかなと思います。これは私の判断です。で、私自身ブレグジットしてからこのイギリスに来てるので、当時の雰囲気だったり様子だったりっていうのはわかるわけもなく、そこに対しての意見は僕は特に持ってないです。で、この動画もそうなんですけれども、これまで出してきた動画も、なるべくバイアスのない状態で皆さんにお届けしていきたいなというふうに思っていて、今回も同じように私自身は何もバイアスがない状態で皆さんにお届けをしていくっていうような形になります。ということでごめんなさい。ちょっと前置き長くなっちゃったんですけれども、早速お話を聞きに行ってみましょう。
Okay, well, first of all, thank you so much for today's interview. I just wanted to run a few questions to get your perspective and understand a little bit more on how you feel about Brexit, given that the general public is saying that it was a mistake and maybe people should have voted for remaining in the UK. So I guess my first question to you is, did you support or oppose to Brexit?
I supported Brexit.
Okay. Can you please tell me why you supported the Brexit?
I supported Brexit simply because we joined an economic community, which was a series of countries, and it was just called the EEC. We never had a referendum or a vote on any other countries making laws for the UK.
Okay.
And since the EEC, new laws, we have got further entrenched within the EU, whereas our government officials cannot be held to account because their excuse was, the European Union says this, the European Court of Human Rights says that. So we were always stuck within what was a trading bloc, but then became a political bloc of everybody else making choices and decisions for the people of the UK, rather than our independence being people of the UK making decisions and choices.
And was this a big part of the motivation behind voting for Brexit?
Yes.
Okay.
Independence.
イギリスは1973年1月1日に欧州連合 EU に加盟。その時点では現在の欧州連合 EU ではなく EEC として知られていました。その後 EEC は欧州連合 EU へと発展。貿易、法律、政策における決定権などは EU に属し、環境基準、消費者保護、労働権、競争法、あらゆる方針、規制は集団的な意思決定プロセスの一部となりました。基本的に EU の規制や法律が優先されていたため、加盟国は EU の方針に従う必要がありました。
What is your view on Brexit's impact on UK's economy?
So straight after Brexit, then we had the transition period. Nothing really changed through the transition. After the transition, there was quite a bit of change. So the GDP of the UK, that actually fell by 4%, which was just an initial fear of trade, which that number has then increased and it's back up considerably. That was obviously an impact. Obviously, the benefit is that a lot of companies in the UK who were tied to the trading agreement between the EU, because that's what we were part of, we weren't entitled to go out and go through the vast quantities of the world and do our own independent trade agreements. And these new people now, or the manufacturers now, can go out there and explore the world. And I don't think we should have restricted trade. I think everybody in the world should be able to trade with everybody in the world, regardless of these trade agreements are so restrictive.
EU 所属時、イギリスの企業は EU 圏内の国々とは関税なしに国境を越えた商品やサービスの提供・販売が可能でした。また、イギリスは EU が締結した第三カ国との貿易協定も利用できました。しかし、それらの国々との貿易においては EU が定めた規則に従う必要があり、イギリスが独自で貿易協定を結ぶことはできませんでした。そして EU がまだ貿易協定を結んでいない第三カ国との新たな貿易協定を結ぶとなった場合、EU からの合意が必要でした。そのため交渉には時間がかかることが多かったようです。ブレグジットしたことにより EU の決定を待たずに交渉が可能になった一方、EU を離脱したことで EU との貿易は手続きが増加し、輸出入のコストが上がるなどの課題もあります。
The UK said that we were going to have a seamless trade agreement with the EU, which, on paper, I think it's called the TCA, which is the agreement. It looks like it's a seamless trade deal, and to, I would say, 95% of the population of the UK, oh yeah, government did a real good thing. But they didn't. And again, I don't see any benefits from Brexit at the moment. All I see is broken promises. If we'd have been cleverer, our agreement wouldn't have been that. We would have allowed, or we would have given like a free route to a lot of countries into the EU trade. And that would have made UK stronger. It would have made the UK stronger on the world stage. But no, I don't see any benefit what has happened from Brexit. Not that I'm saying that it shouldn't have happened. If all the promises had been kept, it would have been really good for the UK. But unfortunately, nothing's been honoured.
TCA はイギリスと EU の間に結ばれた貿易協力協定で、イギリスと EU 間の貿易において多くの製品で関税や数量制限を回避できました。ただし EU 所属時と同じ恩恵を全て維持できたわけではなく、通関手続きや付加価値税の処理なども増え、企業にとっての負担となりました。 EU を離脱した後、イギリスはアメリカ、インド、中国など EU 圏外の国々とより良い貿易協定を結べると期待されていました。国際的な貿易協定を独自に締結できることはブレグジットの最大のメリットの一つと考えられていました。イギリスは日本、オーストラリア、カナダなどと新たな貿易協定を締結しましたが、多くの内容は EU がこれらの国々と締結していた貿易協定と似たようなものになりました。
So would you say that is more of a transition and process kind of thing, or?
I don't believe so, because it's been now 9 years. Now, okay, it took 4 years to actually, yes, we voted under the referendum. It then took 4 years for it to be implemented because the government didn't want to leave. Yes, they gave the people a referendum, but they believed that we wouldn't have gone against the narrative, and we did. Mm-hmm. So they had 4 years of a transition. They've had a further 5 years now. They've done absolutely nothing. We've got lazy politicians. We've got corrupt politicians. And this has only highlighted how bad our government is. It's also highlighted how corrupt the media are as well. A lot.
2016年6月の国民投票で離脱派が勝利したが、ここから政治の混乱が始まる。当時のキャメロン元首相は残留派だったため、国民投票で離脱が決まれば辞任すると公言しており、投票翌日に辞任を表明。2017年から2019年にかけては、政治的な行き詰まりや離脱条件をめぐる対立によってブレグジットが進まず、2020年12月、移行期間終了のわずか数日前に貿易協定が最終合意され、企業や国民に十分な準備期間が与えられないまま、新たな貿易協定の下で EU を正式に離脱した。
So when you have the immigrants coming into the UK,
Yeah.
right? So if you're in EU, obviously they can roam.
Yeah,
free,
yeah,
They can
yeah.
just come in.
Yeah, as long as they hold the passports, they can roam.
Right. And I guess that also, in a sense, does put pressure onto the social worker scene. Sorry, that's not the right way. NHS, for example.
Yes. So, and again, this is something that I did look up in 2016, and that was our NHS is, if it was run in the correct way, it's fit for purpose. But when you have open borders and everyone has a right to roam, so every single year in the UK, over 30% of the babies that were born in the UK, the mothers didn't hold a British passport. So therefore, people were using our NHS as a freebie. And the burden of cost is phenomenal to the people of the UK. And this has been going on for many, many, many years. There was a higher statistic, and that was for operations. People were coming to the UK from other countries and knowing that they needed surgery, but it was cheaper to get on a plane and have a holiday, get the surgery in the UK. This is 35% of operations. It was cheaper to do that than it was to pay in their own country for the operation to be done in their own country. So when you've got free borders and too many people running, it's the cost to the NHS. It's also the people of the UK couldn't even get to the NHS.
ブレグジット前、EU 市民は EU 共通で使える健康保険 EHIC によってカバーされており、イギリスを訪れた際に NHS の医療を受けることができました。治療費は各自の出身国が負担し、イギリス側に払い戻される仕組みでした。しかし、イギリス政府は EU 諸国からの払い戻しが遅れる、または全額回収できていないケースがあるとの報告があります。イギリス政府の中には、この健康保険 EHIC 制度を利用する EU 市民が NHS に負担をかけているのではないかと懸念を示す声もありましたが、データ上 EU 移民の NHS 利用による負担よりも彼らの納税や経済貢献の方が大きいとする分析もあります。
I actually, 2016, 17, I stood on a piece of wood and it went straight through my foot. And went through the bottom and came out the top. I went to the hospital. I waited 4.5 hours. Well, I know they can't stitch me after 4.5 hours because and I know that this isn't, how can I put, this isn't legal migration, but there was some illegal immigrants that had been caught. They were in the hospital and they were being tended to before me. I left the hospital. I never got stitched. I had to do it when I was back here. A friend of mine got an abscess while we were in Germany. Went to the pharmacy. Sorry, you need antibiotics. I'll have to go to the hospital. Went to the hospital. Where's your money? They would not give my friend any pain relief or antibiotics until he paid for it. And he said, when you get back, you can claim for it off your own NHS. And I absolutely think that's perfect. That's what should happen. But we don't. We're a free-run country.
イギリスでは不法移民を含む在留資格を持たない人々でも NHS の一部の医療サービスを受けることが可能でした。特に緊急性がある場合や公衆衛生上の理由から NHS は治療を提供することが義務付けられています。そのため不法移民であっても場合によっては診断・治療は無料で受けることができます。ただ緊急手術など高度な治療が全て無料というわけではなくて、場合によっては治療後に請求されることもあったと報告されています。
Was immigration, in general, a point when you decided to vote?
No.
Okay, it was more about the trade.
Oh God, no. The immigration, it's just a cherry on the cake.
Okay.
You know, because the amount of people burdening the NHS has slowed down since Brexit, and it slowed down considerably, but it still isn't stopped. There is a lot still using the NHS who shouldn't be. But NHS had nothing to do with my decision of Brexit. Immigration had nothing to do with my choice of Brexit. These are just things that come up when you hear something on the news and everyone's being labelled a racist and, you know, oh, you're a racist. No, people of the UK aren't racist. We're very tolerant. And, I don't care what colour anyone is. It's about what comes out of the mouth. Whether you like what they say or whether you don't like what they say, you can still be friends with them.
離脱派のスローガン Take Back Control は特に移民政策のコントロールを求める有権者の共感を得ました。2016年の国民投票の際、移民問題は離脱派の主要な争点の一つとなり、ナイジェル・ファラージュをはじめとする政治家が移民増加のリスクを強調しました。移民問題の議論の多くは国境管理に関するものであり、人種を理由に移民を排除しようという意図を持つものではありませんでした。しかし、離脱キャンペーンの中には移民に対する不安を煽る要素が含まれていたとする批判もあり、移民問題と人種、文化的要素が交錯する場面もありました。
I guess you kind of answered what I wanted to ask you next, but I think the UK was portrayed into a certain image outside the UK for
yeah.
Oh, you. How do you like? What's your thought on it?
Well, 52% of the UK population were not racist, but we were portrayed in that light. I think that was probably the biggest lie of Brexit, and that was construed by the media. And that was everyone who was, it was all based on immigration. It was all based on, and it wasn't. The majority of people just got sick of the EU. Yeah, how we were labelled, it was pathetic. Absolutely pathetic. People just wanted to be sovereign nation. And it is great to be independent.
There are some critics out there who's saying that, you know, related to what you just said, that Brexit happened because there was this nostalgia to what the Great British Empire or...
Yeah, we're not...
Do you think it has... No, it hasn't.
Absolutely not at all, no. No, the old days of the Empire where the British bulldog, it's nonsense.
Okay.
Absolutely nonsense. All that we want to be, I mean, this is only me personally now, but as an independent nation, you can hold your own government officials. You can put their feet to the fire and say, you said this, you haven't done it. Whereas for the last 30, 40 years, we couldn't do that because the EU said this. And it was an easy trigger to blame somebody else for them not doing their job. We've now just had a government come into power. They've been in for 6-7 months. They've lied through every step of being in power, but they can't blame anything on anybody else but themselves. Whereas we've always had the blame game where, the EU say this, the EU say that. Well, now we're an independent nation, or supposed to be. They can't use those excuses anymore.
Mm-hmm. From what you said so far, I think it really feels that you truly love Britain as a country.
Absolutely, yeah.
And it really feels that you truly hoped in good faith without any malintentions whatsoever that Brexit would be a better result.
It would have been a benefit, yes, if it was implemented.
Which was...
I don't believe it has.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you think it will be?
No, not unless we change. Unfortunately, we are given the illusion of the people who are representing us. We're given the illusion that we're voting for people we choose. Unfortunately, we don't choose those people that we vote for. Those political parties nominate the person for us to vote for. Well, that's not a choice. But then we're given the choice and the illusion that we're voting for one of three parties. I do believe that a big shake-up of our political system, and obviously this Reform Party, whether I believe in the Reform Party or not, the votes, well, I don't know. I don't know if there is a political leader left in the UK yet, like Donald Trump is doing for America. You know, Viktor Orban is doing for Hungary. The Polish PM, I think he's a fantastic man. He's doing what is good for Poland. Unfortunately, the UK, our Prime Minister, is doing what's good for everybody else's country, not our own. And until we vote properly, I don't know what's going to happen. It's just a shame. It's a shame for the UK.
Was there anything that you wanted to share to the Japanese audience?
Yeah, never give up your sovereignty. Yeah, don't give up don't give up any sovereignty, because we did, and we have done our best to get it back. If your media and politicians are all singing to the same hymn sheet, vote better than we did. That's what I would say. Vote better than we did. Our government's corrupt. Our media's corrupt, and we just need a shake up. And we will get it eventually, whether it's in my lifetime or in the future. There will be a shake up. And whether there's a shake-up completely of the political system, I hope so. The people have to stand together. We are divided by culture, we're divided by race, we're divided by religion, we're divided by values, whether it be monetary, the rich versus the poor, the middle class versus the working class. And until we can see past all this division and stand together as a nation, we're never going to maximise or minimise anything. We're just going to be the people of the UK who are taxed to death and lied to for the rest of our lives.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much. Thank
No
you so
problem.
much for your time.
ということで皆さん、今お話をさせてもらって、出てきたところなんですけれども、どうでしょうか。皆さんがご想像されていた、内容だったでしょうか。それとも、メディアが、発信する内容と大きく乖離があったでしょうか。一個人の意見でしかないので、どこまでそのブレグジットを賛成する方々の間で、この意見が通用するのかっていうのはちょっと僕にはわからないんですけれども、一旦こういう意見があるっていうのを、本日、共有させていただきました。ということでちょっと今回の動画はこちらで以上となります。もし何かご感想等ありましたらコメントにてお願いします。最後までご視聴いただきありがとうございます。